The wind howled across the Montana Territory like a wounded animal driving needles of sleet against the weathered walls of Silver Creek Ranch. December 1886 had descended with the fury of an avenging god, and Ethan Cole stood at the frost-covered window of his main house, watching his cattle struggle in the brutal cold. 28 degrees below zero. The thermometer outside the barn had registered that temperature for 3 consecutive days, and Ethan knew what it meant. Death, loss, the slow erosion of everything he had built with his own hands over the past decade. He was 26 years old, though the Montana frontier had aged him in ways that went deeper than his sun-weathered face and calloused hands. A decade of building Silver Creek Ranch from raw wilderness into a functioning cattle operation had taught him that the frontier gave nothing freely. Everything worth having required blood, sweat, and the kind of determination that separated survivors from casualties. Through the window, he could see his herd of Hereford cattle huddled against the wind, their breath forming clouds of steam that froze instantly in the bitter air. 147 head in the upper pasture cut off by drifting snow from the main ranch. In the past 3 days, he had already lost 23 animals to the cold. At $30 per head, that represented nearly $700 gone vanished into the frozen earth like so much vapor. The loss stung, but what haunted Ethan more were the two wooden crosses behind the bunkhouse. Thomas Murphy and Jack Wilson, ranch hands, who had worked for Silver Creek for 3 years, had succumbed to pneumonia the previous winter. Good men, reliable workers gone because the frontier took more than it gave. Ethan had learned early that attachment only made the inevitable losses harder to bear. His mother, Elizabeth Cole, had died when he was 12 years old. Not from disease or accident, but from something more insidious. The frontier had broken her spirit long before it claimed her body. A Boston-born woman who had followed her husband west with dreams of adventure, she had withered under the crushing isolation and endless hardship of Montana Territory. By the time she died in 1873, his father, Robert, had already become the bitter, emotionally distant man who would spend the next 15 years building an empire while his heart remained frozen. The lesson had burned itself into young Ethan's consciousness. Never let emotional weakness compromise your purpose. Never care so deeply that loss destroys you. Build your empire, protect your interests, but keep your heart guarded behind walls as strong as the squared log timbers of the ranch house. A throat cleared behind him. Sam Porter, his ranch foreman, stood in the doorway with a newspaper in his weathered hands. At 52 years old, Sam had seen enough of frontier life to recognize when a man was wrestling with ghosts. Mail came in, Sam said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who had spent too many winters breathing freezing air. Got something that might interest you, boss. He tossed a worn copy of the Sacramento Bee onto the rough-hewn table. The newspaper was 3 weeks old, its pages yellowed and crinkled from the long journey north. Ethan glanced down at the folded paper, his eye catching a column of small advertisements on page 4. Matrimonial ads, Ethan's voice held skepticism. You serious? Sam's expression remained neutral, but there was purpose in his eyes. Ranch this size needs a woman's touch. Needs children running around someday. A man alone is just alone, boss. Ethan turned back to the window, jaw tight. Frontier's no place for a city woman. They come out here with their fancy dresses and tender hearts, then wither like spring flowers in August heat. I've seen it happen. The memory of his mother's slow decline surfaced unbidden. Her increasingly hollow eyes, her silence that grew heavier with each passing month. The way she had simply stopped fighting, stopped hoping until one morning she had not risen at all. Your mother, Sam said quietly, reading Ethan's thoughts with the ease of someone who had known him since he was 16, came west because your father dragged her. Didn't give her a choice, didn't prepare her proper. That ain't the same as a woman who chooses this life with eyes open. It all ends the same way. Does it? Sam's weathered face creased into something that might have been a sad smile. I had 20 good years with my Martha before the fever took her. 20 years of coming home to warmth and laughter instead of cold silence. I'd take those 20 years over 50 years of safe loneliness any day. Ethan said nothing. Sam's wife had died 7 years ago, and the foreman still kept her photograph on his bedside table in the small cabin he occupied near the main house. Suit yourself, Sam said after a long moment. But a man building something this big ought to have someone to build it for. Otherwise, what's the point? You gonna leave all this to the wind? He departed, leaving Ethan alone with the newspaper and the howling Montana wind. Against his better judgment, Ethan found himself reading the matrimonial advertisements that evening. Most were exactly what he expected. Widows with children seeking security, shop girls tired of city life, women whose desperation bled through the carefully composed lines. Then his eyes landed on one that was different. Young woman of good character and education seeks correspondence with honest gentlemen. Unafraid of hard work and solitude, desires partnership, not charity. Miss GM General Delivery, Boston, Massachusetts. Something in those straightforward words stirred him. No flowery promises, no desperate pleas, just practical honesty. The phrase desires partnership, not charity, suggested a woman who understood the difference between dependence and mutual benefit. Ethan pulled a sheet of paper from his desk drawer and began to write. His words were as economical as his nature, free of romantic embellishment or false promises. Miss Morrison, I own 400 acres in Montana Territory, 380 head of cattle, two-story house, squared logs, not a cabin. Winter temperatures reach 30 degrees below zero. Isolated 6 months of the year. Work is hard. No theaters, no dress shops, no Boston society. Need a woman to manage household, keep books, work alongside me. Not looking for a servant, looking for a partner. What practical skills do you have? Do you understand what isolation truly means? E. Cole, Silver Creek Ranch. He sealed the letter before he could reconsider and gave it to Sam to post when the next supply wagon went to Timber Creek. 3 months of correspondence followed, each exchange revealing more about the woman who would transform his understanding of what the frontier could hold. Grace Morrison's first reply arrived in late January 1887. Her handwriting was neat and precise, the mark of someone educated and disciplined. Mr. Cole, I have managed Morrison House, a 12-room boarding establishment, for 5 years. I maintain accounts, handle purchasing, supervise staff, and provide basic medical care. I work 14-hour days as a matter of course. I understand isolation. Boston can be isolating in its own way, surrounded by crowds, yet understood by no one. My question for you is whether you seek hired help or a true partner. There is a difference. G. Morrison. The directness pleased him. No false modesty, no coy evasion, just a clear statement of capabilities and an equally clear challenge. His second letter went deeper into his goals and warnings. I intend to build Silver Creek into the largest ranch in Montana, large enough that my children's children need never worry about their livelihood. But I will not mislead you about the dangers. Grizzly bears. Blackfeet raids rare, but they happen. Horse thieves, disease. I lost 2 good men last winter. Not to violence, just to winter itself. Her response acknowledged the risks without flinching. My father died of heart failure in 1883. My mother followed a year later from grief, though the doctors called it pneumonia. I have managed the boarding house ever since, until my brother sold it from under me 3 months ago. He has arranged a marriage for me with Mr. Blackburn, a widower of 52, who requires someone to manage his household and provide heirs. I realized I had never made a single choice about my own life. Everyone else decided what I should want, need, become. Coming west is my choice. Building something lasting would be my achievement, not merely my duty. Ethan found himself sharing more than he had intended in subsequent letters. He detailed the ranching business with technical precision. Spring calving season, when new cattle were born. Summer grazing in the high pastures. Fall roundup, when they brought the herds down and sorted out which animals would go to market. Winter feeding, the hardest season, when they had to provide hay and hope the weather did not kill too many. He explained the economics bluntly. Cattle prices fluctuated between $25 and $35 per head, depending on weight and market conditions. Annual operating costs ran approximately $2,800 for staff wages, equipment feed, and other necessities. In a good year, Silver Creek generated $4,200 in revenue. In a bad year, they barely broke even. He also warned her about the railroad. Northern Pacific is buying up land throughout this region. Man named James Hartwell represents them. Wants to run tracks through here. I've refused to sell, but he's persistent. May lead to legal trouble. You comfortable with that? Her response revealed an unexpected depth of practical knowledge. I have handled legal matters for the boarding house for 5 years. Contracts, taxes, disputes with suppliers. I am not afraid of paperwork or lawyers. What I am curious about is whether you would consider teaching me the actual work of ranching, not merely the domestic aspects. That question impressed him more than he cared to admit. Most women, even those brave enough to consider frontier life, assumed their role would be confined to kitchen and household. This woman wanted to understand the entire operation. His final letter was an invitation. Come to Montana if you are serious. He included $75 for travel expenses, a sum that represented nearly 3 weeks of ranch profits, but seemed a worthwhile investment if it meant finding the partner his operation needed. Grace Morrison's acceptance arrived in early April. I will arrive on the April 23rd stage at Timber Creek. I look forward to meeting you and assessing whether this arrangement can be mutually beneficial. On April 23rd, 1887, Ethan Cole stood outside the Timber Creek General Store, hat in hand, stomach knotted with equal parts anticipation and dread. What madness had possessed him to invite a stranger into his life? What if she took one look at the harsh reality of Montana and demanded the return fare immediately? The stagecoach rattled into town with dust billowing behind it like a prairie fire. The door swung open and Ethan braced himself for disappointment. Instead, what emerged was a woman who would utterly transform his understanding of frontier strength. Grace Morrison stood 5 feet 4 inches in sensible brown boots, her traveling dress a practical blue cotton that had clearly seen better days, but was clean and well-maintained. At 22, her face carried both youth and determination in equal measure. Honey blonde hair was secured practically beneath a simple hat, though errant strands had escaped during the journey. Her complexion, naturally fair, had already begun acquiring the sun-kissed look of someone who had spent days traveling west. What struck Ethan most was not her obvious attributes, though her clear green eyes and gentle curves would have captured any man's attention. It was the way she surveyed her surroundings with keen assessment rather than dismay. She looked at Timber Creek the way an investor might evaluate a business opportunity, noting the general store, the small church, and the saloon with the same analytical attention. Mr. Cole, she said, extending a gloved hand with the confidence of a business partner rather than a prospective bride. Miss Morrison. Ethan took her hand, briefly feeling the firmness of her grip. Welcome to Timber Creek. I hope the journey has not been too difficult. Long but manageable, she replied. Her voice carried the refined cadence of Boston education, but none of the affected softness he had expected. I hope meeting me has not delayed your work too severely. The practical concern caught him off guard. Nothing that cannot wait? Is this all your baggage? He gestured to the single trunk being unloaded from the coach. A small smile touched her lips. Yes, your letters were quite explicit about practicalities. I saw no sense in bringing what would not serve. Ethan felt an unexpected flicker of approval. The buggy is this way. Town is not much, as you can see. It has the essentials, she observed, glancing at the handful of buildings that comprise Timber Creek's commercial district. The rest is what people make of it. As they drove the 12 miles to Silver Creek Ranch, Grace asked intelligent questions that surprised him with their technical depth. What breed of cattle do you raise? Mostly Hereford. Good beef cattle handle cold well. About 100 crossbreed with Texas Longhorn for extra hardiness. Water source. North Creek runs through the property, provides good water most of the year, though it freezes 4 to 5 months in winter. We have a well that goes 47 feet deep for those months. Predators. Wolves are not much of a problem anymore. Weather is the real killer. That and cattle rustlers. You mentioned in your letters that you have horses as well. 47 head, 12 quarter horses for working cattle, 35 Mustangs we break and sell. Good market for trained horses. Grace absorbed this information with the focus of someone taking mental notes. Ethan found himself answering more fully than he had intended, impressed by her genuine interest. Your letters mentioned wanting a wife to help with operations, she said finally as the ranch buildings came into view. I should be clear, Mr. Cole. I did not come west to be merely decorative. I intend to earn my place. Ethan studied her profile against the setting sun. The Montana sky painted her in shades of gold and amber, and for a moment he saw not just a practical arrangement, but the possibility of something more. This is not Boston, Miss Morrison. Life here breaks most people. I have seen strong men give up and return east. Women do not last long if they cannot adapt. I am aware. Something haunted flickered behind her eyes. Boston broke people too, just differently. I prefer to choose my challenges rather than have them thrust upon me. Silver Creek Ranch loomed before them as they crested the final rise. The main house stood solidly constructed, 32 feet by 24 feet of squared logs, each 12 inches in diameter. A shake roof crowned the structure, and 6 real glass windows glinted in the late afternoon sun. Real glass windows were a luxury in Montana territory, a statement that the owner intended permanence. The barn stretched 40 feet by 30, large enough to shelter 20 horses and store feed. The bunkhouse, smaller but equally well-built, housed 8 sleeping spaces for ranch hands. A corral of split-rail fence enclosed a 60-foot diameter area where horses could be worked. Beyond these main structures, smaller buildings served various purposes: smokehouse equipment, shed, and the necessary outhouse. It is more than most have, Grace said quietly, her gaze traveling over the compound. You have built something substantial here. She turned those perceptive green eyes on him. The question remains whether you truly want someone to share it with, or if you simply need a housekeeper who will not require additional quarters. The directness caught him off guard yet again. I do not know, he admitted, surprising himself with honesty. I know a ranch this size needs a woman's influence to become a proper home. I know I am tired of returning to empty rooms after long days. Beyond that, he shrugged. Then we have a starting point, Grace said simply. I suggest a 3-month arrangement. I will fulfill the duties of a rancher's wife: cooking, cleaning, managing the household, keeping your books, whatever tasks need doing. You will provide safety and fair treatment. At the end of 3 months, if either of us finds the arrangement unsatisfactory, you will pay my fare back to Boston, plus wages of $45 per month for my time. Ethan stared at her, momentarily speechless. No tears, no romantic notions, just practical business terms laid out as clearly as any contract. And if we suit each other, he managed to ask, then we marry properly, before witnesses with legal standing as true partners. It was the most unusual proposal Ethan had ever heard, and yet it made perfect sense. 3 months to determine compatibility without the pressure of an immediate, irrevocable commitment. 3 months for both of them to assess whether this arrangement could truly work. That is reasonable, he said. I agree to your terms. I find reason serves better than sentiment on most occasions, Grace replied, though something wistful colored her tone. Shall we meet your staff? Sam Porter emerged from the barn as they approached, his weathered face creasing into what might have been approval as he took in Grace Morrison's practical attire and direct gaze. Sam Porter, ranch foreman, Ethan introduced. Sam, this is Miss Grace Morrison from Boston. Ma'am, Sam touched his hat brim. Welcome to Silver Creek. Mr. Porter, I look forward to learning from your experience. Grace's tone was respectful but not deferential. Sam's eyes flickered to Ethan with an expression that clearly said, this one will do. Miguel Rodriguez was working with a sorrel gelding in the corral, his skilled hands gentle as he examined the horse's foreleg. At 31, Miguel was the best horse trainer in 3 territories, though his Mexican heritage meant he faced prejudice from some of the neighboring ranchers. Ethan had hired him 5 years ago, based purely on talent, and had never regretted the decision. Miguel handles our horses, Ethan explained. Best trainer in Montana. Grace watched Miguel work for a moment, her expression thoughtful. I would like to learn that skill if Mr. Rodriguez is willing to teach. Ethan glanced at her in surprise. You want to learn horse training? If I am to be a rancher's wife, I should understand all aspects of the operation. What if you are injured or away? Someone should know these things. It was practical logic, but it went against every expectation Ethan had held about what a wife's role would entail. He found himself reassessing his assumptions. That evening, Grace moved efficiently around the kitchen that had seen little proper use since Mrs. Peters, their previous cook, had returned east the year before. The ranch hands typically ate simple fare prepared by whoever drew the short straw, but tonight delicious aromas filled the house. Where did you learn to cook? Ethan asked, setting the table at her request. Necessity, Grace answered, sliding a pan of golden cornbread from the oven. My father died when I was 16. My mother followed a year later. I managed our boarding house until my brother sold it from under me. Ethan frowned. You mentioned only distant relations in your letters. William is distant in all ways that matter. Her tone closed the subject as she laid out a hearty stew cornbread and preserved peaches. Will your foreman be joining us? Sam takes meals with the men unless invited. I thought this first night should be just us. Something softened in Grace's expression. A wise choice. First impressions matter, and I would rather know who I am potentially tying myself to before meeting everyone else. They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence until Ethan found himself saying, "This is the best meal I have had since coming to Montana." Thank you, though I suspect the competition has not been particularly fierce. Her smile transformed her face, bringing warmth to her practical demeanor. Ethan found himself smiling back. True enough. Later, showing her to the small bedroom off the kitchen that had been hastily prepared, Ethan explained awkwardly, if we marry, I will have the master bedroom upstairs ready. For now, I thought this more proper." Grace nodded. "It is entirely suitable. Good night, Mr. Cole." "Ethan," he corrected impulsively. "If you are to be mistress of this house, even temporarily, you should use my given name. Then you must call me Grace." She hesitated. "I appreciate your consideration for propriety, Ethan. Many men would not have bothered." He tipped his head in acknowledgement. "Sleep well, Grace." As Ethan climbed the stairs to his lonely room, he realized something had shifted. For the first time in years, the house felt like more than shelter. It felt like it held possibility. The next weeks brought remarkable changes to Silver Creek Ranch. Grace proved herself both capable and determined, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast for the hands, then tackling the neglected house with systematic efficiency. By the second week, curtains appeared at windows, the pantry was organized with military precision, and a small kitchen garden had been started behind the house. More surprising was her insistence on learning ranch operations. Ethan found her one morning in the barn with Miguel, receiving instruction on treating minor equine injuries. "You do not need to do this," Ethan said, leaning against the stall door. Grace looked up from where she was applying liniment to a sorrel gelding's fetlock, her hands steady and sure. "If I am to be a rancher's wife, I should understand the business. What if you are injured or away? Someone should know these things." Miguel grinned. "She has steady hands, Patron. Better than some cowboys I have trained." Ethan could not argue with that assessment. Instead, he found himself including Grace in more aspects of ranch life. She rode out with him to check fence lines, asked intelligent questions about cattle breeding, and even assisted during a difficult calving when extra hands were needed. One evening, as spring thunderheads gathered on the horizon, they sat on the porch watching lightning illuminate the distant mountains. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" Ethan asked suddenly. "A woman with your abilities could have found security in Boston." Grace was quiet so long he thought she might not answer. "Security is not the same as purpose," she finally said. "After my parents died, I managed our boarding house for 5 years. When William sold it, he offered to find me a suitable husband, a business associate twice my age who needed someone to manage his household and provide heirs." She looked out at the gathering storm. "I realized I had never made a single choice about my own life. Everyone else decided what I should want, need, become." Lightning flashed, illuminating the steel in her eyes. Coming west was my choice. Building something lasting would be my achievement, not merely my duty. Ethan studied her profile, seeing for the first time the vulnerability beneath her practical exterior. "And if I am just another man deciding your fate?" "You are not," she said simply. "You offered terms, I countered. We agreed as equals." She turned to him. "The question is whether you truly want a partner or merely someone to ease your loneliness without disturbing your solitude." The insight struck uncomfortably close to Ethan's core. He had built walls around himself after watching his mother's spirit crumble under frontier hardships, convinced that emotional distance was the only protection against inevitable loss. "I do not know if I know how to be a proper husband," he admitted. "The men I respected growing up were hard men who survived by keeping their hearts guarded." And were they happy, these survivors? Ethan thought of his father, who had lived another 15 lonely years after his mother's death, becoming more bitter with each passing winter. "No, but they endured. Is that all you want from life, to endure?" Grace's question hung between them as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Before Ethan could answer, hoofbeats pounded into the yard. Miguel rode up, rain plastering his shirt to his body. Patron North Creeks is flooding. The yearlings in the upper pasture are cut off. Ethan was on his feet instantly. Saddle my horse. Wake the hands. I will come too, Grace said, rising. No. Ethan's tone was sharper than intended. Stay here where it is safe. Something like disappointment crossed her face, but she nodded. I will have dry clothes and hot food ready when you return. Hours later, soaked to the bone and exhausted, Ethan led his men back to the ranch. They had managed to move the yearlings to higher ground, but not before two were swept away by the raging creek. At $30 per head, it was a $60 loss, painful but far less catastrophic than it could have been. True to her word, Grace had kept the stove hot and food ready. She had organized the wet, tired men with quiet efficiency, ensuring each had dry clothes from the spare supply she had systematically cataloged weeks earlier. Hot coffee and whiskey appeared as if by magic, followed by bowls of hearty stew. She worked alongside Mrs. Porter Sam's wife, who had come from the foreman's cabin to help, moving with the practiced competence of someone who had managed crisis situations before. No hysterics, no useless questions, just calm, effective action. Ethan watched her care for his men with the same practical compassion she showed in every task. When she finally approached him with dry clothes and a steaming mug, he accepted both gratefully. You should change before you catch your death, she said softly. I have drawn hot water in the kitchen for washing. Later, as the ranch settled into exhausted quiet, Ethan found Grace still awake, mending a shirt by lamplight in the kitchen. You should rest, he said, lowering himself into a chair across from her. It has been a long night. I wanted to be sure everyone was settled. Her fingers moved steadily with the needle. Did you lose many cattle? 2 yearlings. Could have been the whole herd without Miguel's warning. Ethan watched her hands, strong and capable, as they repaired what was broken. You have been good for this place. She glanced up, surprise evident in her face. Thank you. I have been thinking about what you asked earlier, about enduring versus living. He struggled to find words for thoughts he had never fully examined. When my mother died, something in my father died too. He taught me that caring too deeply was dangerous out here. Grace set down her mending. And yet you have built something that requires deep care. This ranch, these people, they matter to you. They depend on me. That is not the same thing. Her green eyes held his steadily. Dependence can exist without caring. You could be the fair employer, a competent rancher without investing your heart. But you do not just give these men wages. You give them respect, belonging, purpose. Ethan had never considered his actions in such terms. It is just good business to treat people right. Is that why you rode out in a dangerous storm tonight, business? The question lingered between them, unanswerable in any way that would not require admitting truths Ethan had spent years denying. He rose suddenly, exhausted beyond words. Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow will come early. As he climbed the stairs, Ethan found himself thinking not about the 2 yearlings he had lost, but about the woman sitting in his kitchen, mending shirts for his men. A woman who had proven in just a few weeks that she was more than he had bargained for, and perhaps exactly what he needed. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Montana landscape, but inside Silver Creek Ranch, something new had taken root, something that might, given time and courage, grow into the partnership both Ethan Cole and Grace Morrison secretly hoped to find. May brought transformation to Silver Creek Ranch. The brutal Montana winter had finally released its grip, giving way to the brief, glorious spring that made frontier life almost bearable. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in riots of purple and gold, and the cattle moved to higher pastures where fresh grass grew thick and green. But the transformation was not merely seasonal. In the 6 weeks since Grace Morrison had arrived, Silver Creek had evolved from a functional cattle operation into something approaching a true home. Grace's management had brought order to chaos. The pantry, once a haphazard collection of supplies, now operated with inventory lists and rotation schedules that prevented waste. The ranch's financial records, previously scattered across loose papers and half-remembered mental notes, had been consolidated into a proper ledger book with neat columns tracking every expense and revenue source. It was while reviewing those records that Grace made a discovery that would prove her value extended far beyond domestic efficiency. Ethan, she said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table after supper, her finger tracing down a column of numbers. Did you pay Whitmore's feed supply $112 last September? Ethan looked up from the saddle he was mending. Sounds about right. Why? Because according to your delivery receipts, they only sent $83 worth of feed. You overpaid by $29. He frowned, setting down the leather strap. You certain? Grace turned the ledger so he could see, pointing to the discrepancy between the invoice and the actual goods received. Unless I am reading these records incorrectly, which I do not believe I am. Ethan studied the numbers of irritation building as he realized she was absolutely correct. Son of a... He caught himself. That is $29 I will never see again. Perhaps not that particular sum, but I have been reviewing your purchasing patterns. If we coordinate with the neighboring ranches for bulk orders, we could reduce feed costs by approximately 15%. Over a year, that would save roughly $180. He stared at her. Where did you learn this? Survival. Grace closed the ledger with a soft thump. When my father died, I was 16 with a 12-room boarding house and $800 in debt. I learned quickly or lost everything. Numbers do not lie, Ethan. They simply tell you the truth if you know how to read them. That weekend, Grace implemented the first phase of her strategy to build alliances that would serve purposes beyond mere economics. We should host Sunday dinners, she announced over breakfast on Saturday morning. Ethan paused coffee cup halfway to his lips. What? Neighboring ranchers and their families. Start with the Thompsons. William Thompson has been ranching west of here for 20 years, you said. His wife Martha is well respected in the community. If we establish good relations with them, others will follow. I am not much for socializing. This is not socializing, it is strategy. Grace's green eyes held a calculating light that reminded Ethan she was far more than a simple homemaker. That railroad man Hartwell, he cannot force eminent domain, and if the majority of landowners in this region oppose his route, we need allies. Ethan set down his cup impressed despite himself. You have been thinking about this. I have been thinking about everything. She rose to clear the breakfast dishes. You built this ranch with hard work, Ethan, but it becomes truly valuable when it connects to others. Isolation is vulnerability. Community is strength. The first Sunday dinner took place on May 15, 1887, and proved Grace's strategic instincts were as sharp as her financial acumen. The Thompson family arrived at 2 in the afternoon. William Thompson was 55, weathered by 3 decades of Montana ranching, but still vigorous. His wife Martha, 52, had the capable bearing of a frontier woman who had survived and thrived. Their 2 adult children, Jacob and Sarah, completed the party. Grace had prepared a meal that balanced hospitality with practicality. Roast beef from Silver Creek, cattle mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans from last year's canned stores, and an apple pie she had learned to make from Mrs. Porter. The total cost of ingredients was approximately $2.40, but Ethan recognized it as an investment rather than an expense. Fine spread, Mrs. Cole, William Thompson said, then corrected himself. Pardon me, Miss Morrison. Grace, please. She smiled warmly. And thank you. I hope the pie meets Montana standards. Mrs. Porter was kind enough to share her recipe. If it tastes half as good as it smells, you will have no complaints from me, Martha Thompson replied. The conversation flowed easily through the meal, touching on weather cattle prices and the challenges of spring calving. Then Ethan steered the discussion toward the topic that mattered most. Thompson, you heard anything more about those railroad plans? The older rancher's expression darkened. Hartwell came by 2 weeks ago, wanted 800 acres on my western boundary, offered $4 an acre. That is actually fair market value, Grace observed quietly, which makes me curious why you did not sell. William looked at her with new respect. You know land prices. I researched them before coming west. $4 per acre is standard for grazing land in this territory. But Mr. Thompson, your western boundary includes that natural spring, does it not? Water rights make that land worth considerably more. Exactly right. William leaned back in his chair. Hartwell knows it too. That is why he wants it. Control the water, control the region. Grace's eyes met Ethan's briefly before she continued. Mr. Thompson, your son Jacob is looking to expand his operations soon, I understand. Martha nodded. Jacob wants to start his own spread within the next 2 years. Then perhaps we have mutual interest to discuss. Grace's tone remained conversational, but Ethan could see the careful calculation behind her words. If the railroad takes land from everyone, prices will spike and availability will plummet. But if we present a unified opposition, we control the market ourselves. William Thompson studied Grace with the intensity of someone reassessing initial assumptions. Keep talking. By the time the Thompsons departed that evening, Silver Creek had secured its first formal alliance. Thompson agreed to oppose Hartwell's railroad expansion, and in exchange, Ethan would have first rights to purchase Thompson's yearling bulls at a favorable price. Additionally, Jacob would work part-time at Silver Creek to learn advanced ranching techniques that would help him establish his own operation. That woman, Sam Porter, said later, as he and Ethan watched the Thompson wagon disappear into the twilight, just built you more security in 4 hours than you managed in 4 years. I'm aware, Ethan replied, but there was no resentment in his voice. Only growing respect and something else he was not quite ready to name. Over the following 3 weeks, Grace orchestrated 3 more Sunday dinners, each one carefully calculated to build the network of alliances that would protect Silver Creek's interests. George Harrison, who ranched 1,200 acres to the north, was a widower struggling with labor shortages since his wife's death 3 years earlier. Grace proposed a shared labor pool with Silver Creek, lending 2 hands during Harrison's harvest in exchange for similar assistance during their busiest seasons. Alliance secured. David Bennett ranched 600 acres to the east. Ethan disliked Bennett on instinct. The man was 39 but carried himself with an arrogance that set Ethan's teeth on edge. His wife Sarah was 24 and visibly pregnant, perhaps 5 months along. Grace noticed immediately what Ethan had missed. The bruises on Sarah's arms carefully hidden beneath long sleeves that seemed excessive for the warm May weather. The way Sarah never made eye contact with her husband. The slight flinch when David raised his voice. Grace said nothing during the dinner, maintaining perfect social propriety. But Ethan saw the calculation in her eyes and knew she was planning something. The fourth alliance proved most significant. Carlos Rodriguez Miguel's older brother owned 400 acres to the south. Carlos was 45, an experienced rancher who faced constant discrimination because of his Mexican heritage. Local buyers routinely offered him 20 to 30% below fair market value for his cattle, knowing he had few options. Sell to us, Ethan proposed during that dinner, a plan he and Grace had discussed beforehand. Fair price, same as we would pay anyone else. We will sell them under the Silver Creek brand. No one needs to know where they originated. Carlos's eyes gleamed with moisture. He quickly blinked away. You would do this? Partner with a man who delivers quality product at fair terms, any businessman would. Ethan extended his hand. We have a deal. We have a deal. The alliance with Carlos secured something more valuable than cattle. It secured absolute loyalty from both Rodriguez brothers, men whose skills and knowledge were worth more than gold in Montana territory. By early June, 5 of the 7 major ranchers in the region had aligned with Silver Creek. Hartwell's railroad expansion had become significantly more complicated. James Hartwell recognized the shift in power dynamics quickly. The Northern Pacific Railroad Extension Company had invested considerable resources in surveying this route, and corporate headquarters in Chicago was demanding progress. Hartwell had a deadline of August to complete land acquisition or risk losing funding entirely. Legal intimidation was his first response. In mid-June, a surveyor appeared at Silver Creek claiming to possess a deed dated 1881 for 400 acres of ranch property. The deed named a Marcus Sullivan as the original owner, predating Robert Cole's purchase. This is absurd, Ethan said, staring at the document the surveyor had presented. My father bought this land directly from the territorial government in 1876. There was no Marcus Sullivan. The surveyor shrugged. I just filed the claims, Mr. Cole. You will need to sort this out with a judge. Sam Porter rode to Helena, the territorial capital, to investigate. He returned a week later with troubling news. The deed is fake, Sam reported, but it is a damn good fake. Professional quality, right paper, correct stamps. I cannot prove Hartwell is behind it, but the timing is suspicious. How much will legal fees cost to fight this, Grace asked. Sam grimaced. $300, maybe more, and that is if we win quickly. It was a significant sum, but Grace was already calculating. We can afford it. The question is whether this is Hartwell's only tactic or merely the first move. It was unfortunately merely the first move. 1 week later, 23 head of cattle vanished from Silver Creek's southern pasture. The theft was professional, the trail leading north toward railroad work camps before disappearing entirely. At $30 per head, the loss totaled $690. Ethan hired 2 additional guards at $50 per month, each increasing operating costs while simultaneously reducing profits. Then the supply chain disruptions began. Whitmore's feed supply, previously reliable, suddenly claimed to be out of stock. Ethan discovered that Hartwell's company had purchased their entire inventory, forcing Silver Creek to buy feed from suppliers 50 miles away at 30% higher cost. The local blacksmith became mysteriously too busy to repair equipment, delaying critical maintenance. "He is trying to bleed us dry," Grace said one evening as they reviewed the mounting costs. "Hartwell does not need to win legally. He just needs to make staying here more expensive than selling." "So what do we do?" Grace's smile was sharp. "We fight smarter, not harder." Her counter-strategy was threefold. First, she wrote detailed letters to the territorial governor documenting Hartwell's intimidation tactics, with copies sent to the Helena Independent newspaper. Public pressure, she reasoned, was more powerful than private confrontation. Second, she organized the allied ranchers into a purchasing cooperative. Bulk orders placed collectively gave them negotiating power the individual operations lacked. They shared equipment, reducing dependence on the hostile local blacksmith. Third, she arranged direct sales to buyers in Helena, cutting out the middlemen who had been quietly pressured by Hartwell's company. "You are waging economic warfare," Ethan observed with something approaching awe. "I am protecting our investment," Grace corrected. "There is a difference." It was in this context of escalating tensions that disaster struck in late June. The summer had been unusually dry. The spring rains that normally kept Montana's grasslands lush and green had failed to materialize, leaving the landscape parched and brittle. Ethan watched the weather with growing concern, knowing that drought could be as deadly as winter in this unforgiving land. On June 28th, lightning struck during an afternoon thunderstorm. The bolt ignited dry grass on the eastern boundary of Silver Creek property. Within minutes, wind-driven flames were racing toward the ranch buildings. Miguel spotted the fire first, his sharp eyes catching the column of smoke rising above the ridge. "Fuego!" he shouted, racing toward the main house. "Fire!" Ethan emerged at a run, saw the orange glow on the horizon, and felt ice flood his veins. Fire was every rancher's nightmare. It could destroy in hours what had taken years to build. "Get the wagon loaded," he ordered Grace. "Important papers, valuables, anything we cannot replace. If the fire jumps North Creek, we evacuate to town." Grace's face was pale but composed. "I will prepare, but I am not leaving unless you order me to go." There was no time to argue. Ethan organized the men into teams. Miguel led the effort to move horses from the barn to the northern pasture away from the advancing flames. Tom Wilson and 3 others began plowing a fire break, a 20-foot strip of bare earth that might stop the fire's advance. Sam coordinated bucket brigades from the creek to wet down the buildings. Grace moved with systematic efficiency, loading critical documents into the wagon. Legal papers, financial records, the small metal box containing $200 in emergency funds. Then she made a choice that would later seem prescient. She carefully wrapped the framed photograph of Ethan's parents in his mother's quilt and placed it gently in the wagon. When Ethan returned to check on her progress, he found her in his office securing that photograph. "How did you know to save that?" he asked. "It is the only personal item you display," she answered simply. "Everything else in this house serves a function. This serves a memory." Something shifted in Ethan's chest, recognition that this woman saw him more clearly in weeks than people who had known him for years. "The fire is moving fast," he said. "If it crosses the East Ridge, I want you to take the wagon and head to town." Grace straightened. "And you?" "I stay with the men to protect what we can." "Then I stay as well." Her tone brooked no argument in. "Grace, this is dangerous. I did not come west to run from difficulty." She met his eyes steadily. "If this is to be my home, I will not abandon it at the first sign of danger." The simple declaration struck Ethan with unexpected force. If this is to be my home. Not your home, but my home. In that moment, without formal ceremony or legal contract, Grace Morrison had claimed Silver Creek Ranch as her own. "Very well," he conceded, "but you stay with Mrs. Porter at the main house. If I give the order to evacuate, you go. No arguments." The fire raged through the afternoon and into the evening. Neighboring ranchers, alerted by the smoke visible for miles, arrived with their men to help. William Thompson brought 8 workers. George Harrison contributed 5. Carlos Rodriguez appeared with 6 men from his spread. More than 25 people fought the flames, united by the understanding that fire respected no property boundaries. Today, it threatened Silver Creek. Tomorrow, it might threaten any of them. Grace's contribution was not what Ethan expected. While Mrs. Porter organized the women and children in the main house, Grace inserted herself into the bucket brigade. Position 4 of 12, she passed water-filled buckets with the same determined efficiency she brought to every task. When men collapsed from smoke inhalation, she administered basic medical care. When fighters grew weak from hunger and exhaustion, she coordinated the rotation of food and water. At 4:30 in the afternoon, disaster struck. The fire jumped the firebreak embers carried by wind landing on the barn roof. 47 horses were still inside, representing more than $3,000 in value and years of breeding and training work. Ethan faced an impossible choice: save the horses or save the house. He could not protect both. Grace materialized at his side, soot-covered and exhausted, but utterly focused. "We are not losing that barn. It is too dangerous." "Then do not waste time arguing." She turned to Miguel. "Release the horses, all of them. Drive them to the north pasture." Miguel nodded and moved with the speed of someone who understood crisis. Within 5 minutes, all 47 horses were galloping to safety. "Now," Grace continued, her strategic mind working at full speed, "we need 4 people on that roof with wet burlap. If we can keep the shingles damp, the embers will not catch." "Who is going up there?" Ethan demanded. "I am." Grace's jaw was set. "Tom Wilson, Jacob Thompson, and Carlos. 4 people, 4 corners." "Absolutely not. We need 4. I and number 4. Get the burlap and buckets up there now." There was no time to argue, no time to find alternatives. Tom, Jacob, and Carlos were already climbing. Grace followed, moving with the careful determination of someone who had made a decision and would not be swayed. For 30 minutes, Ethan's heart resided in his throat as 4 people he cared about stood on a barn roof while embers rained down around them. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking. Grace's clothing caught fire, once quickly extinguished by Tom's alert action. But the wet burlap held. The roof smoked but did not ignite. At 5:15, the wind shifted. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. Within 30 minutes, the fire was dying. By 6 o'clock, it was extinguished. The damage assessment revealed they had been fortunate. The barn stood intact, though repairs would cost $200. The main house was untouched. 80 acres of grazing land had burned, and 200 yards of fence would need replacement. One small equipment shed was a total loss. 4 people had suffered minor burns. 10 showed signs of smoke inhalation. Grace's left hand bore a second-degree burn, 3 inches by 2, from when her glove had caught fire. Ethan tended her injury himself, his hands shaking as he applied salve to the angry red skin. "You could have died on that roof," he said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer suppress. Grace winced from pain but met his eyes. "But I did not, and the barn still stands. The empire is not worth your life." "Not your empire anymore, she said quietly. "Ours." That single word, spoken with absolute conviction, changed everything. That night, as exhausted firefighters bedded down wherever they could find space, Ethan found Grace sitting on the porch, her bandaged hand resting in her lap. She stared out at the smoke still rising from the scorched pastures. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. For a long moment, neither spoke. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why risk everything?" "Because in these past 10 weeks, I found what Boston never gave me." Grace's voice was soft but steady. "Purpose, belonging, partnership with a man who treats me as an equal." "I am afraid." The admission cost him dearly. "Afraid of caring too much. The frontier takes what we love. Or it teaches us that what is worth having is worth fighting for." She turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "You can build walls to protect yourself, Ethan, but walls do not prevent loss. They only guarantee loneliness." He reached out, his calloused fingers gentle as they touched her cheek. She did not pull away. They did not kiss, not yet, but something profound was acknowledged in that touch. An understanding that whatever contract they had signed, whatever practical arrangement they had agreed to, had evolved into something neither had anticipated. By early July, with 2 weeks remaining in their 3-month agreement, the tension at Silver Creek was palpable. Not the tension of conflict, but the charged atmosphere of unspoken feelings in imminent decisions. The ranch thrived under their joint management. Costs had decreased 18% while efficiency climbed steadily. The alliance of ranchers now numbered 6 operations, creating enough political pressure that Hartwell's railroad plans had stalled indefinitely. But beneath the practical success, something more profound was developing. Ethan found himself watching Grace as she taught children from neighboring ranches to read in the small schoolroom she had established. He noticed how she hummed softly while working in her garden, unconscious melodies that spoke of contentment he had never heard in his mother's voice. He saw how the other women in the community sought her counsel, how the men respected her judgment, how Silver Creek had become more than a cattle operation. It had become a home. Grace, for her part, found herself imagining futures she had not dared to hope for. Not just security or partnership, but genuine affection. The kind of marriage where respect deepened into tenderness, where shared work created bonds stronger than romance alone could forge. The crisis came unexpectedly, as crises often do. Grace found Sarah Bennett in the garden one afternoon in mid-July. Sarah was 7 months pregnant, now her condition obvious. She was also sporting fresh bruises. One eye was swollen completely shut. Her lip was split. Fear radiated from her like heat from a stove. "He does not want the baby," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Says it will tie him down. He kicked me." Grace's fury was ice cold and absolutely controlled. "You are staying here, tonight. David will not allow it. David does not decide your life anymore." Grace's tone left no room for argument. "Come inside. I will prepare a room." When Ethan returned from checking the northern fence line an hour later, Grace met him at the door. "I have offered Sarah Bennett sanctuary. Do you have a problem with that?" Ethan looked past her to where Sarah sat at the kitchen table, Mrs. Porter tending her injuries. His jaw tightened. "None. Bennett needs a lesson about treating wives properly. Mrs. Bennett, you stay as long as you need." David Bennett arrived 2 hours later, drunk and angry. He pounded on the door, shouting for his wife. Ethan met him on the porch, Winchester rifle held casually in his hands. Not raised, not threatening, just present. "She is my wife," Bennett slurred. "Give her back." "She is here voluntarily. Leave my property." "The law says she belongs to me." "The law also says a man who beats his pregnant wife is a coward." Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. "Leave now." Sam Porter appeared from the shadows, Colt revolver drawn. "Boss said leave." Bennett stared at the 2 armed men, calculated his odds, and found them wanting. "You will regret this," he spat. "And the only thing I regret," Ethan replied, "is not acting sooner. Go." Bennett mounted his horse and rode into the darkness, but his final shouted threat hung in the air. "You will pay for this." That evening, Grace and Ethan sat on the porch as they had so many times before. But tonight felt different, weighted with significance. "Thank you for supporting me about Sarah," Grace said. "No need for thanks. It was the right thing to do." "Not every man would see it that way." "I am not every man." Silence settled between them, comfortable but charged with unspoken feelings. "1 week," Grace said finally. "Then our 3-month agreement ends." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. "Yes." "Have you thought about what comes after?" He turned to face her, fully seeing her illuminated by the last rays of sunset. This woman, who had arrived with one trunk and practical expectations, had transformed not just his ranch, but his understanding of what life could hold. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about it every day." Before Grace could respond, hoofbeats shattered the evening quiet. Not a single rider, but several. 5 men rode hard toward the ranch, torches blazing in the gathering darkness. Ethan was on his feet instantly, Grace right behind him. "Riders!" Miguel's warning shot split the air. "Riders incoming." What had been a moment of potential confession became a moment of violent crisis. Ethan grabbed his Winchester, checking that it was loaded. Sam emerged from the bunkhouse with his Sharps rifle. Miguel took position with a repeating rifle. Tom Wilson appeared with a shotgun. Grace ran inside, returning with Ethan's Colt revolver in one hand and ammunition in the other. She had learned to shoot during her weeks at Silver Creek, insisting that a rancher's wife should know how to defend herself if necessary. The 5 riders pulled up just outside the main yard, far enough to avoid easy gunfire, but close enough for their voices to carry. One man, clearly the leader, held a torch high. "Hartwell sends his final offer." the man shouted. $5 per acre. Take it or everything burns. Ethan recognized the voice. Frank McCready, a known gunslinger who hired out to railroad companies and mine owners. 4 other hired guns flanked him. Tell Hartwell no, Ethan called back. Wrong answer. McCready's torch arced through the air, landing near the barn. His men opened fire, not aiming to kill but to intimidate. Bullets slammed into the barn walls. Ethan returned fire, his Winchester shot deliberately aimed at McCready's horse. The animal screamed and went down, throwing its rider. Sam Sharps barked, hitting another rider's arm. Miguel's rifle shots forced the gunman to take cover. From inside the house, Grace fired the Colt through a window, not hitting anyone, but demonstrating that the ranch would not surrender easily. The gunfight lasted 5 minutes, but felt like hours. Then wagon wheels and hoofbeats announced the arrival of the Timber Creek sheriff and his deputy, alerted by neighboring ranchers who had seen the smoke and riders. 3 of the gunmen fled immediately. McCready with his injured horse could not run. The man Miguel had shot in the arm was too wounded to escape. Under questioning facing jail time, the wounded gunman confirmed what everyone suspected. James Hartwell had hired them to intimidate Ethan into selling $500 for a successful mission. By morning, Hartwell was under arrest. The railroad board, facing public scrutiny and legal complications, recalled him to Chicago. The Silver Creek expansion route was shelved indefinitely and the ranch was safe. But the price had been paid in fear and blood. Tom Wilson had taken a bullet to the shoulder, survivable but painful. The barn bore fresh damage, and Ethan had come within inches of losing Grace when a bullet shattered the window frame 2 feet from where she stood. The next evening, as the ranch recovered from the violence, Ethan found Grace in the garden. The 3-month agreement would expire in 2 days. Everything hung in the balance. 3 months are finished, Grace said without preamble. Yes. I need to know something before I decide. What? Do you want me to stay because I am useful or because of something else? Ethan had spent 10 weeks building toward this moment, 10 weeks learning that walls built to prevent loss only guaranteed loneliness. The words came easier than he expected. When I wrote that advertisement, I wanted an employee, someone to make the ranch run smoothly. But you came and made everything different. Not just the ranch, me. You made me believe that caring is not weakness, that partnership is not risk, that building an empire alone is empty. He stepped closer, close enough to see the hope and vulnerability in her green eyes. I want you to stay, not because of ranching skills or accounting, because I cannot imagine this life, any life, without you in it. Grace's smile bloomed slowly. When I came here, I wanted independence, purpose, a chance to build something mine. I found those things, but I also found something unexpected. A man who treats me as an equal, who respects my mind as much as my strength, someone I want to build beside, not behind. She paused, meeting his eyes directly. But I need more than respect, Ethan. I need affection, partnership of the heart, not just the hands. Ethan took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that had formed during her weeks of frontier work. Hands that had fought fire, defended their home, built something real. Grace Morrison, marry me. Not for contracts or convenience. Because together we have built something neither of us could alone. Because I want to spend every remaining day building more. Yes, her voice was steady, certain, joyful. 1,000 times yes. They kissed, then finally sealing with tenderness what had been forged through trials and proven through fire. The cowboy who had needed a wife had found something far greater. A partner and equal, a woman whose strength matched his own. And together they would build an empire that mattered not for its size, but for the lives it touched and the legacy it would leave behind. 2 weeks after Ethan Cole proposed to Grace Morrison, as preparations for their wedding filled the days with purposeful activity, a rider appeared on the horizon. The stranger sat uncomfortably in his saddle, his expensive suit already covered in the dust of frontier travel. He rode a hired horse from Timber Creek, the kind of mount that spoke of temporary necessity rather than skilled horsemanship. Sam Porter spotted him first, his experienced eyes narrowing as he assessed the approaching figure. Something about the man's bearing suggested city breeding and the arrogance that often accompanied it. "Rider coming," Sam called to Ethan, who was working with Miguel to repair fence damage from the recent fire. "Hired horse from town, stranger." Ethan straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. The August heat was oppressive, the kind that made even simple tasks feel like battles against the elements. He watched the stranger approach, instinct telling him this was not a casual visit. Grace emerged from the house, drawn by Sam's warning. The moment she saw the rider, the color drained from her face. Ethan noticed her reaction, immediately moving to her side. "What is it?" "William," she whispered. "My brother." William Morrison was 36 years old, impeccably dressed, despite the trail dust, and carrying himself with the confident bearing of a Boston businessman accustomed to getting his way. He dismounted with obvious relief, clearly unused to long hours on horseback. "Grace," his tone was cool, assessing. "You look rustic." "William." Grace's voice betrayed none of the anxiety Ethan had seen flash across her face. "This is unexpected." "Indeed." William's gaze swept over Silver Creek Ranch, taking in the main house, the barn, the corrals, all with an expression that suggested he found the entire enterprise quaint and beneath consideration. "When your letter stopped arriving at our agreed-upon address, I was forced to make inquiries. I see you have found accommodations." Grace's spine straightened. "This is Ethan Cole, owner of Silver Creek Ranch. Ethan, my brother, William Morrison." Then extended his hand, measuring this man who had sold his sister's boarding house and tried to arrange her marriage to an old widower for business connections. William's handshake was firm but brief, his assessment of Ethan equally cursory. "Mr. Cole, I trust you have treated my sister with appropriate consideration." "Miss Morrison has been treated with every respect she deserves," Ethan replied evenly. "She has become invaluable to this ranch and this community." William's tight smile did not reach his eyes. How charming. Grace always did have a talent for making herself useful. However, her little frontier adventure has gone on long enough. I have come to bring her home. Ethan felt Grace stiffen beside him, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I am home." "Do not be ridiculous." William waved a dismissive hand. "This was merely an impulsive reaction to disappointment. The arrangement I proposed with Mr. Blackburn still stands. He is willing to overlook your indiscretion in fleeing Boston." Ethan's protective instincts flared. "Miss Morrison is not going anywhere she does not wish to go, and she certainly does not need any man overlooking anything about her character or choices." William's expression hardened. "This does not concern you, rancher. Family matters should remain private." "Ethan is my family now," Grace interjected, her voice carrying a strength Ethan had come to recognize. "We are to be married. I sent you a letter explaining my decision weeks ago." "Which I never received." William's tone suggested he did not believe in her. "Convenient. Nevertheless, you remain my responsibility until properly married. As your only male relation, I cannot permit such an unsuitable match." "Permit?" Ethan stepped forward, his patience evaporating. "Your sister is a grown woman who has demonstrated more intelligence and character than most men I have known. She does not require your permission for anything." William's smile turned calculating, the expression of someone about to play what he believed was a winning card. "Perhaps not, but she might require your awareness of certain facts before you commit to this arrangement." "William, do not," Grace warned, genuine fear entering her voice for the first time. "Mr. Cole deserves to know exactly what sort of woman he is welcoming into his home." William paused for effect, clearly savoring the moment. "My sister failed to mention she was engaged once before. To a respected Boston physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who discovered, quite unfortunately, that she is unable to bear children. A rather significant omission for a man seeking to build a dynasty in this wilderness." The cruel revelation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Ethan saw Grace flinch, as if physically struck, her complexion turning ashen in the harsh afternoon light. This was the secret she had carried, the weight that had pressed on her through all their weeks together. The fear that had kept her silent, even as their partnership deepened into something more. Ethan's first instinct was protective fury, but he controlled it with the discipline frontier life had taught him. "I think we should continue this discussion inside. Miss Morrison, would you ask Mrs. Porter to serve supper?" Grace hesitated, clearly torn between fleeing the humiliation and standing her ground. Her green eyes met Ethan's, searching for something: rejection, understanding. He tried to communicate reassurance in that brief glance, but there was no time for extended conversation. "Please," Ethan added softly, "I will join you shortly." Once Grace had retreated to the house, Ethan turned to William with cold fury barely contained beneath a veneer of civility. You came 1,000 miles to publicly humiliate your sister. That suggests either remarkable dedication or remarkable cruelty. William straightened his jacket, unimpressed by Ethan's anger. I came to prevent her from making another disastrous decision based on romantic notions. Grace has always been impractical, despite her sensible appearance. Our parents indulged her excessively. And what is your interest in her future genuine concern or something else? William admitted without shame. Mr. Blackburn's business connections would be exceedingly valuable to my import company. Their arrangement would benefit all parties. Except Grace. I am securing her future with a man who accepts her limitations. Can you say the same rancher, a man building an empire like this, needs heirs? The question struck at Ethan's deepest fears with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Legacy, continuation. The future generations he had imagined inheriting Silver Creek Ranch. Everything he had worked to build, everything that would mean nothing without someone to carry it forward. For a moment, doubt clouded his resolve. He thought of his father, of the bitter years after his mother's death, of the lesson drilled into him that caring too deeply was dangerous on the frontier. He thought of empty nurseries and the dynasty he had dreamed of establishing. Then he thought of the empty house before Grace arrived, the cold meals eaten in silence, the crushing loneliness of success without connection. He thought of Grace on the barn roof fighting fire beside his men, of Grace organizing the community, managing finances, standing up to railroad intimidation, of Grace making Silver Creek not just a property, but a home. I will ask you one question, Ethan said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. Does Grace know the terms of this arrangement, that her marriage was meant to secure your business dealings? William's silence was answer enough. Get back on that horse, ride to town, take the next stage east. Ethan stepped closer, every inch the hardened rancher who had survived a decade of Montana's harshest challenges. If you are still here tomorrow, you will learn exactly how we deal with cattle thieves in Montana territory. You cannot threaten me. That was not a threat. It was frontier justice. Ethan's eyes held steel that William recognized despite his city breeding. Stealing a man's future for personal gain is no different than stealing his livelihood. Both earn the same consequences here. He moved closer, still voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And if I ever hear you contacted Grace again, threatened her or interfered with her life in any way, Montana is very big, very empty. People disappear. William assessed the steel in Ethan's eyes and evidently found it convincing. Grace will regret this decision when winter comes, and she is trapped in this wilderness with a man who resents her barrenness. The only thing I resent, Ethan replied, is not meeting Grace sooner. Leave now. William Morrison departed 30 minutes later, defeated and furious but recognizing when he had lost. Ethan watched him ride toward Timber Creek before turning to face the harder conversation waiting inside. He found Grace in the kitchen, standing rigid as a fence post as she mechanically arranged plates on a tray. Her eyes were dry but red-rimmed when she turned to him, braced for rejection. William is returning to town tonight, Ethan said simply. Relief and disbelief warred on her face. He agreed to leave. He recognized the wisdom of an early departure. Ethan moved closer but did not touch her, sensing her fragility. Grace, why did you not tell me? She set down the plates with deliberate care. Would it have mattered if you had known from the beginning that I could not give you children? The question deserved honest consideration. Ethan thought of the legacy he had been building, the dreams of sons and daughters to inherit his life's work. Then he thought of the reality Grace had created versus the fantasy he had imagined. It would have mattered, he acknowledged finally, and saw pain flash across her face. But it would not have changed my decision to write to you, and it certainly does not change my wish to marry you now. Tears welled in her eyes. You do not need to say that out of pity or obligation. I have never said anything to you from either. Ethan closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. Silver Creek was just land and buildings before you came. You made it a home not just for me, but for everyone here. That is a legacy worth building with or without children. A tear slipped down Grace's cheek. I should have told you. I was afraid. We are all afraid of something. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. I spent years afraid of caring too deeply, convinced the frontier would take whatever I loved. But you showed me that building walls does not prevent loss. It only guarantees loneliness. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. We can have family without blood relation. You already built community here, made connections, gave people belonging. That is legacy more powerful than names on a family tree. Grace's hands tightened on his. What happens now? Now I ask you again with full knowledge and open eyes. Ethan's voice softened with emotion he no longer tried to hide. Grace Morrison, will you marry me? Not for what you can give me or what I can provide you, but because together we have built something neither of us could create alone. Her smile bloomed through tears, transforming her face. Yes, Ethan Cole, 1,000 times yes. They held each other, then walls down completely. Hearts exposed and vulnerable in a way that would have terrified both of them mere months ago. The partnership forged through practical arrangements had been tested by fire intimidation and devastating revelation only to emerge stronger for the trials. The wedding took place on August 20th, 1887, in the small church at Timber Creek. The entire ranching community turned out to celebrate, approximately 80 people crowding into a building designed for half that number. Grace wore a simple cream dress ordered from the Sears catalog 3 months earlier, purchased with private hope, before she had any certainty the arrangement would lead to marriage. The dress cost $12, a practical sum for a practical woman, but the simple elegance suited her far better than elaborate silk and lace would have. Ethan stood at the front of the church in his only suit, clean-shaven and uncomfortable in formal clothing, but unable to take his eyes off his bride as she walked down the aisle. The ceremony was traditional but significant in its small departures from convention. When the pastor asked who gave the woman, Sam Porter stepped forward in the role of surrogate father. She gives herself supported by this community, Sam said, and Ethan saw tears glisten in the old foreman's eyes. The vows they spoke were standard words, but charged with meaning earned through shared trials. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and health until death do us part. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, when Ethan kissed Grace before their assembled community, it felt like more than the joining of two individuals. It felt like the recognition of something already built, already proven, already real. The reception at Silver Creek Ranch that afternoon was a celebration of community as much as marriage. Ranchers and townspeople mingled with ranch hands. Miguel played guitar, filling the air with traditional Mexican songs that spoke of love and loyalty. Mrs. Thompson had brought 6 apple pies. Sarah Bennett, now 7 months pregnant and living independently on Silver Creek property after leaving her abusive husband, served lemonade with a smile that suggested healing was possible, even from deep wounds. Sam's toast captured the essence of what they had built. Boss, when you sent for a bride, you got yourself a partner instead. Best decision you ever made. Ethan's response was simple. Luckier than I deserve. That night in the master bedroom, Grace had transformed with simple touches into a true home. They consummated their marriage with a mixture of tenderness and passion that felt like the natural culmination of everything they had built together. I never thought I would find this, Grace whispered against his lips. A place to belong, someone to belong to. We belong to each other now. Ethan answered, his hands gentle on her waist. All I have, all I am, it is yours. And I am yours. Whatever comes, whatever challenges we face them together. Moonlight spilled through the window, casting silver patterns across their bed as they discovered the physical expression of the emotional partnership they had forged. The cowboy who had needed a wife had found something far greater. A love strong enough to withstand the harshest Montana winter, the hottest summer drought, and all the unpredictable seasons of life on the frontier. The months and years that followed proved the foundation they had built was solid. Silver Creek Ranch thrived under their joint management. Grace's systematic approach to finances, combined with Ethan's ranching expertise, created an operation that was both profitable and sustainable. By the end of their first year of marriage, the ranch generated $6,800 in profit, more than triple what Ethan had managed before Grace's arrival. But the true measure of their success was not financial. The community they had built together transformed the isolated ranches of the region into a network of mutual support. The Sunday dinners continued rotating between different ranches. The school Grace had started served 15 children from 6 families. The women's cooperative she organized provided not just economic benefit, but social connection for frontier wives who might otherwise have faced crushing isolation. Sarah Bennett gave birth to a healthy daughter in January 1888, assisted by Grace, who had studied medical texts and learned basic midwifery. Ruth Elizabeth Bennett came into the world surrounded by women who would ensure her mother never again faced the violence that had marked her marriage to David Bennett. Miguel married a young woman from Carlos Rodriguez's ranch, and their wedding was the social event of the spring. The fact that a Mexican vaquero could marry with the full support and celebration of the ranching community spoke to how thoroughly Grace and Ethan had reshaped the social landscape. Winter came and went. Harsh seasons that in previous years had meant significant losses now saw minimal casualties, thanks to better preparation and coordinated resource sharing among the allied ranches. Silver Creek expanded purchasing adjacent properties as they became available, growing from 2,400 acres to 3,100 acres by 1890. Through it all, Ethan and Grace built a life together that was remarkable not for its drama, but for its deep contentment. They worked side by side during calving season. They spent evenings reviewing accounts and planning strategies. They hosted community gatherings and defended their neighbors when necessary. They did not speak of children. The absence was acknowledged in silence, a shared understanding that what they had built together was enough. Grace poured maternal energy into teaching the children who attended her school. Ethan found satisfaction in mentoring young ranchers like Jacob Thompson, who sought to learn from his experience. It was a good life, a full life, and both felt grateful for what they had found together. Then in the spring of 1892, 5 years after their wedding, everything changed again. The Johnson family were settlers attempting to cross North Creek during spring flooding. Peter and Mary Johnson, both in their early 30s, had been traveling to Helena with their 4-year-old daughter, Emma Claire. The crossing should have been routine, but the wagon overturned in current swollen by snowmelt. Both parents drowned. Only Emma survived, pulled from the water by a passing rider and brought traumatized and alone to the nearest ranch. Silver Creek. Grace opened the door to find the rider holding a small, shivering child wrapped in a blanket. Emma Claire's blue eyes were wide with shock, her honey blonde hair plastered to her head. She was crying the broken sobs of a child who did not yet fully comprehend the enormity of her loss. "Found her downstream," the rider explained. "Parents did not make it. Figured you folks would know what to do." Grace took Emma without hesitation, wrapping her in warmth and murmuring soft reassurances. She carried the child inside, started a warm bath, found clean clothes that would need significant alteration to fit the tiny frame. She fed Emma warm soup and sat with her as the child cried herself into exhausted sleep. Ethan watched his wife with this orphaned child and felt something shift in his chest. The maternal tenderness Grace showed, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, the gentle competence as she cared for Emma's physical and emotional needs. This was what they had been missing without knowing it. 1 week later, Emma was still at Silver Creek. The nearest orphanage was in Helena, a 2-day journey away. The proper course would be to arrange transportation to send this child to the institutional care available for orphans in Montana Territory. Neither Grace nor Ethan could bring themselves to do it. "I have been thinking," Grace said one evening as Emma slept in the small room off the kitchen. "Emma has no family. The orphanage in Helena is the only option. But what Ethan knew where this was leading and felt his heart expand with the possibility. But she could have family here, with us. She belonged to us from the minute you held her," Ethan said simply. "I knew it then. I know it now." The adoption process took 3 months of legal proceedings through the territorial court. Emma Claire Johnson became Emma Claire Cole in August 1892, exactly 5 years after Ethan and Grace had married. The love Ethan felt for this small girl had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. Emma was theirs not because biology dictated it, but because they had chosen to make her theirs. And in that choice, Ethan finally understood what Grace had tried to tell him years earlier. Legacy was not about DNA. It was about values passed on, love freely given, and the family you built through commitment rather than circumstance. On a warm spring morning several months after the adoption, Ethan stood on the porch of Silver Creek Ranch watching Grace and Emma in the garden. Emma, now 4.5 years old, had discovered a ripe strawberry hidden beneath green leaves. Her delighted laughter echoed across the yard, pure and joyful. Grace knelt beside her patient and loving, teaching Emma about plants and growth and the patience required to cultivate living things. The scene was so perfect, so complete, that Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. Emma spotted him and ran across the yard, her small legs pumping with determined energy. "Daddy, look!" She held up the strawberry like a precious gem. The word daddy still had the power to warm Ethan's chest even months after Emma had first used it. He lifted her high in the air, her giggles warming the spring afternoon. "That is perfect, sweetheart." Grace joined them, slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity of absolute belonging. She looked up at him, her green eyes holding a question. "Happy?" Ethan looked at his wife, his daughter, and the thriving ranch stretching toward distant mountains. Silver Creek was no longer just his dream. It was their reality, built by three people who had found each other through circumstances none could have predicted. More than anything I thought possible. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as workers went about their tasks. The ranch employed 12 hands now, plus 2 teachers for the expanded school and a full-time cook. The community they had built numbered more than 30 families, all connected through the network of mutual support Grace had initiated years earlier. Sam Porter emerged from the barn, now 57, but still vital and engaged. He had become Grandpa Sam to Emma and the other children, dispensing wisdom and stories with equal generosity. Miguel worked with a young horse in the corral, his sons Dago and little Miguel watching and learning. The horse breeding program he had developed had made Silver Creek famous throughout Montana Territory. Sarah Bennett lived in a small cabin on Silver Creek property with 4-year-old Ruth supporting herself through seamstress work and teaching at the school. She had blossomed from a frightened, abused wife into a confident, independent woman. All of these lives touched and improved. This was the legacy that mattered. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep between them on the porch swing, Grace and Ethan sat holding hands as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you think we built something lasting?" Grace asked softly. Ethan looked at the ranch, the community, the daughter sleeping peacefully, the wife who had transformed his understanding of everything important. "We built more than a ranch. We built a home, a family, a legacy that is not measured in acres or head of cattle, but in lives we touched and values we passed on." He thought about the journey they had taken together. A practical arrangement born from a newspaper advertisement had become something neither could have imagined. They had faced fire, violence, betrayal, and devastating revelation. They had survived and thrived, not despite the challenges, but because of how they faced them together. "I never regretted answering your advertisement," Grace said. Ethan kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of sun and garden soil, and the woman who had become his entire world. "And I never regretted writing it. You showed me the frontier is a place for love. It just needs the right people to make it thrive." As the first star appeared in the Montana sky, Silver Creek Ranch stood as testament, not just to what hard work could build, but to what love, partnership, and community could create. A legacy that would endure far longer than any of them passed through Emma, through Miguel's children, through Sarah's daughter, Ruth, and through the countless lives touched by the simple choice to build together rather than stand alone. The cowboy who had needed a wife had found the woman of his dreams. Together they had built an empire that mattered not for its size, but for its heart. And that empire would stand long after they were gone, carried forward by those who understood that the greatest legacy is not what you leave behind, but what you build while you are here. The Montana wind whispered through the pines as Ethan Cole held his family close, grateful beyond words for the practical woman from Boston who had answered his advertisement and changed everything. Grace Morrison had come west seeking purpose and partnership. She had found both, and in finding them, had given Ethan Cole something he had not known he needed: a home, a family, a life worth living, and that he thought as sleep began to claim him was the only empire that truly mattered.